For years, the most powerful force in this industry wasn't money, fame, or influence. It was silence. Not loud silence. Not suspicious silence. The kind of silence that looks normal, respectable, professional. Stories didn't end because answers were given. They ended because questions stopped being asked. Moments passed, interviews moved on, and time quietly did what statements never could. It made people stop expecting clarity. That's why this moment feels different. When a documentary says it's breaking silence, it's not promising revelations out of nowhere. It's promising context. It's promising to revisit moments that were always there, but never placed next to each other. And timing matters. Because silence doesn't break when people are angry. It breaks when silence itself starts to look unnatural, when the gaps become more noticeable than the explanations, when patience turns into suspicion. This isn't about one clip or one headline. It's about years of moments that were treated as separate, never close enough to form a bigger picture. Because once moments connect, the conversation changes. It stops being about personalities and starts being about systems. For a long time, figures like Diddy and Usher existed at the center of influence, access, and mentorship narratives. That position created success, but it also created distance. Distance from scrutiny, from accountability, from uncomfortable follow-ups. And distance is powerful. Distance allows questions to lose urgency. It allows explanations to remain vague. It allows silence to feel like a reasonable response instead of a strategic one. But distance collapses when people start looking backward with intention. Old interviews don't sound the same anymore. Old jokes don't land the same way. Old explanations feel thinner when replayed without context protecting them. Halfway through this story, let me say this clearly. If you're here for fast drama, this isn't that. But if you're here for real, long-form breakdowns that actually connect dots instead of chasing shock, make sure you're subscribed. Because this story only makes sense if you stay with it. The idea that nothing new happened is exactly the point. What's new is the willingness to stop moving on. The willingness to ask why silence kept showing up at the same moments. Why conversations always softened before reaching the center. Why time was allowed to replace accountability. Silence was never empty. It was full of decisions. Decisions to wait. Decisions to protect relationships.
Decisions to prioritize momentum over reflection.
And when silence is chosen repeatedly, it becomes part of the structure. That's what this documentary is really pressing against. Not accusations and not conclusions, but the comfort silence provided for years. Because once silence breaks, it doesn't shatter loudly. It cracks. And cracks are dangerous. Not because they reveal everything immediately, but because once they appear, nothing can pretend to be untouched anymore. This is where the story truly begins. Once silence cracks, the past doesn't rush forward. It lingers. It sits in the background while people start noticing things they ignored before. Not because they didn't see them, but because they didn't know what to do with them. Context changes everything, and without context, moments are easy to dismiss. That's how this lasted for so long. For years, uncomfortable moments were explained away individually. One interview felt awkward. Another clip felt strange. A story surfaced, then faded. Each time the reaction was the same. Isolate it, minimize it, move on. That approach was intentional. Because isolated moments don't threaten systems. Connected moments do. When you keep everything separate, nothing feels urgent. Nothing feels structural. Nothing forces deeper questions. The audience reacts emotionally, then forgets. The industry keeps moving. But documentaries don't work that way. They don't chase shock. They slow time down. They place moments side by side and let viewers notice what repetition looks like. And repetition is uncomfortable. It raises questions no one wants to answer out loud. Questions like, why certain spaces always felt protected? Why influence came without oversight? Why proximity to power seemed to suspend normal boundaries. This isn't about assuming intent. It's about recognizing patterns. Patterns don't accuse, they reveal. And what's being revealed now is that silence wasn't just absence. It was maintenance. Maintenance of reputation. Maintenance of relationships. Maintenance of an ecosystem where success mattered more than scrutiny. Silence kept things manageable. It allowed people to explain less.
It allowed time to soften memory.
It allowed accountability to be postponed without ever being denied. That's the most effective kind of silence. What's changing now is that people aren't satisfied with postponement anymore. They're revisiting old moments without the comfort of distance. They're asking why explanations always stopped short, why clarity was delayed instead of offered. And once those questions form, they don't go away easily, because they're not emotional. They're logical. If nothing needed to be explained, why did explanations never fully arrive? If nothing crossed lines, why did silence always follow scrutiny? If everything was harmless, why does context suddenly matter so much? Those questions don't require belief to exist. They survive on observation. That's why this phase feels heavier than past waves of attention. It's not driven by outrage or speculation. It's driven by reconsideration, by people looking back and realizing how much was accepted simply because it was familiar. Familiarity is powerful. It convinces people that what they're seeing must be normal because it's been there for so long. But longevity doesn't equal legitimacy. Sometimes it just means no one stopped it. And now stopping isn't even the goal. Understanding is. Understanding how silence became routine. Understanding how access replaced accountability. Understanding how time was used to smooth over questions instead of answering them. That understanding changes how every old moment feels. What once looked forgettable now feels unfinished. What once felt minor now feels connected. What once disappeared into silence now demands context. And once context enters the conversation, silence loses its ability to end it. It can only delay it. And delays don't work forever. At some point, the question stops being what happened and becomes, how was this allowed to feel normal? That's the shift happening now. Because when people look back, they aren't just seeing moments. They're seeing conditions. Conditions where influence concentrated at the top and responsibility thinned out underneath it. Where success created insulation. Where access became protection. And protection changes behavior. When people know they're protected, they don't feel pressure to explain. They don't feel urgency to clarify. Silence feels safe because nothing forces it to end. And over time, that silence becomes expected. Expected silence is powerful. It trains everyone around it. It teaches journalists where to stop digging. It teaches insiders which questions not to ask. It teaches audiences that some things are off limits without anyone ever saying it out loud. That's how boundaries move without resistance. What's being revisited now isn't just individual moments involving Diddy or Usher. It's the environment that surrounded them, the rooms they had access to, the networks they operated within, and the culture that treated proximity to power as a privilege instead of a responsibility. That environment didn't demand transparency. It rewarded discretion. And discretion, when repeated long enough, turns into silence. This is why old explanations feel unsatisfying now. They were never designed to explain everything. They were designed to explain just enough to keep things moving, just enough to avoid disruption, just enough to prevent deeper examination. But just enough doesn't hold up when people start asking questions across time instead of moments. Why did the same dynamics keep appearing? Why did scrutiny always soften near the same spaces? Why did accountability feel optional instead of expected? Those questions don't accuse anyone of wrongdoing. They accuse the system of comfort. Comfort with ambiguity. Comfort with power operating unchecked. Comfort with letting time do the work silence couldn't. And comfort is dangerous because it dulls instincts. It convinces people that if something were truly wrong, someone else would have stopped it. That logic passes responsibility endlessly upward until it disappears completely. That's what's being challenged now. Not the idea that something shocking suddenly occurred, but the idea that nothing needed to be examined because nothing exploded. Systems don't fail loudly. They drift quietly. They normalize behavior through repetition. They replace accountability with familiarity. And by the time questions feel urgent, years have already passed. What people are noticing now is how much time passed without answers, and how intentional that delay feels in hindsight. Delay isn't neutral. Delay is a decision to wait until attention fades, a decision to let legacy outweigh scrutiny, a decision to trust silence over explanation. And once those decisions are recognized, silence stops looking passive. It looks planned. That recognition changes everything. Because once people see silence as a strategy instead of an absence, they stop respecting it automatically. They stop filling the gaps with benefit of the doubt. They stop assuming clarity will come later. They start asking why it never did. And that question doesn't go away just because time has passed. It grows stronger. Because the longer silence lasts, the more it reveals what it was protecting. And that's the realization that makes this moment impossible to ignore. Silence doesn't just happen. It's learned. It's learned by watching what gets rewarded and what quietly disappears. By noticing which conversations advance careers and which ones end them. Over time, people don't need instructions. They internalize the rules. And the strongest rule has always been this: don't disrupt momentum. Momentum keeps businesses running. Momentum protects partnerships. Momentum convinces everyone that progress itself is proof nothing needs to be questioned. As long as things are moving forward, reflection feels unnecessary, even dangerous. That's how silence became respectable. It was framed as maturity, as restraint, as knowing better than to stir things up. Speaking too much was labeled emotional. Asking too many questions was labeled disloyal. Silence, on the other hand, was called smart. Smart enough to survive. But survival has a cost. When silence is rewarded long enough, it stops being a choice and becomes an expectation. People begin to assume that some topics will never be addressed directly. Not because they can't be, but because they won't be. That assumption shapes everything. Journalists learn where stories stall. Insiders learn which memories stay private. Audiences learn which discomforts are temporary. And once everyone adjusts, the system no longer needs to enforce silence. It enforces itself. What's unsettling now is that this self-enforcement is finally being noticed. People aren't just asking why answers didn't come. They're asking how everyone learned to stop asking in the first place. That's a deeper question, because it points to culture, not individuals, to habits that formed quietly over years, to the idea that silence wasn't about hiding something dramatic, but about keeping things smooth. Smooth surfaces hide uneven foundations, and when those foundations are examined, old narratives feel incomplete. Explanations that once sounded reasonable now feel rehearsed. Pauses that once felt respectful now feel timed.
Timing matters.
If silence were about caution, it would be temporary. If it were about care, it would eventually give way to clarity. But when silence becomes permanent, it serves a different purpose. It delays accountability without denying it. It diffuses responsibility without resolving it. It allows everyone to move forward without ever looking back.
Until people do look back.
And when they do, they notice how often silence appeared at the same points, around the same questions, protecting the same spaces. They notice how consistently time was used to soften scrutiny instead of answering it. That realization doesn't cause outrage. It causes reassessment. People begin to reconsider what they accepted as normal. what they dismissed as awkward, what they assumed didn't matter because it was never explained. Reassessment is powerful because it doesn't need new information. It only needs perspective. And once perspective changes, silence loses its authority. It can no longer rely on familiarity to feel justified. It has to answer for itself. That's why this phase feels different. Not louder, not angrier, more deliberate. Because when people stop mistaking silence for wisdom, the story stops waiting for permission to continue. It moves forward on attention alone. And attention, once focused, is very hard to turn away. Once attention settles in, something subtle but powerful happens. People stop reacting and start observing. They're no longer asking for drama or shock. They're watching behavior, watching timing, watching who steps forward and who quietly steps back. And in that space, actions begin to matter more than words ever did. Because words can be shaped, silence can be managed. But behavior is harder to disguise over time. This is where patterns start speaking louder than any statement. When questions rise and responses slow down, that gap becomes meaningful. When conversations shift away from specifics toward generalities, that shift is noticed. When clarity is replaced by distance, distance becomes part of the story. None of this requires accusation. It only requires consistency. What's unfolding now is a collective recognition that the same responses keep appearing whenever scrutiny reaches certain places. The same careful phrasing. The same reluctance to engage deeply. The same reliance on time to do the work that explanation never did. Time, once again, is being used as a buffer. But time doesn't erase context anymore. It sharpens it. Old interviews resurface. Old comments are replayed. Old silences are lined up next to new ones. And when that happens, the story gains depth without adding anything new. That's what makes this phase uncomfortable. Not because something shocking is being revealed, but because something familiar is being reevaluated. Familiarity no longer protects. Longevity no longer excuses. Reputation no longer closes conversations. People are asking a different kind of question now. Not, did this happen? But, why did this keep happening around the same structures? That question moves the focus away from individuals and toward incentives, toward environments that rewarded discretion over transparency, toward systems that preferred momentum over reflection. And systems respond poorly to sustained observation. They can deflect outrage. They can outlast controversy. But they struggle with patience. Patience exposes repetition. Repetition exposes design. And design forces accountability in ways denial never could. This is why silence feels heavier now. It's no longer a pause. It's a position. A position that has to be interpreted because it's been chosen repeatedly. People aren't demanding answers out of anger. They're waiting for them out of understanding. And waiting, when informed, becomes pressure. Pressure not from volume, but from persistence. From knowing that every non-response adds weight instead of relief. That every delay raises another question instead of closing one. That every attempt to move forward without looking back only draws more attention to what was skipped. This is where the story deepens. Not toward conclusions, but toward clarity. Because clarity doesn't always arrive as information. Sometimes it arrives as realization. The realization that silence was never neutral. That waiting was never passive. That what felt like distance was actually design. And once that realization settles in, the story doesn't need to be pushed anymore. It carries itself forward, because people aren't watching for what happens next. They're watching for what finally gets addressed. And silence, no matter how carefully maintained, can't answer that forever. There's a reason moments like this don't explode. They pressure. Pressure builds quietly. It doesn't announce itself. It settles in places people once ignored and makes them impossible to overlook. That's exactly what's happening now. The conversation isn't louder. It's sharper. People aren't reacting emotionally anymore. They're measuring responses. They're noticing timing. They're tracking what gets addressed directly and what's consistently avoided. And avoidance has a rhythm. When scrutiny rises, certain explanations appear. When questions deepen, language softens. When timelines are requested, focus shifts elsewhere. This pattern isn't dramatic, but it's consistent. And consistency is where pressure comes from. Because consistency suggests intention. For years, systems relied on the belief that attention would always move on, that people would get bored, that new headlines would replace old discomfort, that silence, stretched long enough, would eventually feel like resolution. But something has changed. Attention isn't moving. It's staying in place and doing what it rarely does. Comparing. Comparing past confidence to present caution. Comparing openness in safe moments to restraint under pressure. Comparing how quickly some topics are addressed versus how carefully others are avoided. Those comparisons don't create outrage. They create unease. And unease is far more difficult to manage. This is the stage where statements stop working the way they used to, where carefully worded responses feel insufficient, where silence stops buying time and starts accumulating meaning. Every pause adds weight. Every delay adds context. Every deflection becomes noticeable. The system isn't being challenged by new claims.
It's being challenged by sustained observation.
Observation strips away urgency and replaces it with expectation. People stop demanding immediate answers. They start expecting eventual ones. And expectation is dangerous because it doesn't fade easily. This is where control begins to slip, not in headlines, not in trending topics, but in confidence. Confidence that silence will be accepted. Confidence that distance will be respected. Confidence that time will smooth things over. Time isn't smoothing anything anymore. It's stacking moments together.
And stacked moments don't disappear.
They wait. They wait until silence feels louder than explanation. Until avoidance feels heavier than engagement. Until the absence of answers becomes the most visible part of the story. That's when pressure reaches its peak. Not because something new is revealed, but because nothing is. Because when clarity is possible but never offered, people start asking why. And why is the one question silence can't outrun. This is where the story tightens, where the room feels smaller, where the margins for avoidance shrink, where every move is watched not for what it says, but for what it avoids saying. The system senses this before anyone admits it out loud. It senses that the old rhythm isn't working, that attention isn't drifting, that silence isn't resetting the conversation anymore. And once that realization sets in, everything changes. Because pressure like this doesn't explode, it forces decisions. And decisions are exactly what silence was designed to postpone. At this stage, silence stops being passive and starts being interpreted. People aren't just noticing that answers aren't coming. They're noticing how they aren't coming. The pauses, the careful wording, the sudden shift from confidence to distance. These details don't disappear into the background anymore. They stand out. Because when pressure builds, behavior changes. And change always tells a story. What's happening now is that silence is no longer being read as restraint. It's being read as calculation. A decision made not once, but repeatedly, across moments that should have invited clarity. That repetition matters. When silence appears in the same places over and over, it stops looking coincidental. It looks intentional. And once intention is suspected, everything around it is reevaluated.
Not emotionally, analytically.
People begin asking why engagement feels selective, why some topics are addressed quickly while others are handled with distance, why explanations expand around safe areas but contract near the center. That contraction reveals boundaries. Boundaries of comfort. Boundaries of risk. Boundaries of what the system is willing to examine publicly. Those boundaries used to be invisible. Now they're visible because attention isn't moving on. And when attention stays, boundaries feel tighter. This is where silence becomes risky, because silence only works when it's assumed to be temporary, when people believe answers will come eventually. But when silence repeats without resolution, it creates the opposite effect. Expectation. Expectation that something is being avoided. Expectation that clarity is possible but withheld. Expectation that silence is serving a purpose beyond patience. That expectation is powerful. It changes how everything is received. Statements are read more closely. Absences are noticed more sharply. Even neutrality feels deliberate. This is the phase where the story no longer needs momentum. It has gravity. Gravity pulls attention back no matter how far the conversation tries to move away. New topics surface, new headlines appear, but the same questions resurface underneath them. Because unanswered questions don't expire. They wait. They wait for patterns to become obvious, for reactions to become predictable, for silence to accumulate enough weight that it can no longer be mistaken for wisdom. That's where things are now. Not at accusation, not at resolution, but at recognition. Recognition that silence functioned as a tool. Recognition that waiting was a strategy. Recognition that what felt like distance was actually design. And once that recognition spreads, silence loses its power to calm the conversation. It starts feeding it, because every time silence appears now, it confirms the very thing it was meant to prevent. Attention. Sustained. Focused. Unavoidable. This is where the system feels pressure without being attacked, because no one is shouting. They're watching. And being watched, especially patiently, is something silence was never built to withstand. From here on, the story doesn't need a push. It moves forward on awareness alone. This is the moment where the balance shifts. Not because someone speaks louder. Not because new footage appears, but because silence itself stops working. Up until now, silence slowed everything down. It bought time. It softened reactions. It allowed distance to grow between questions and consequences. But once people understand how silence operates, it loses its camouflage. It becomes visible. And visibility changes everything. People start to recognize that silence isn't empty space. It's filled with choices. Choices about timing, about language, about what gets acknowledged and what gets avoided. When those choices repeat, they stop feeling cautious and start feeling deliberate. That's when attention sharpens. The audience isn't reacting anymore. They're tracking how quickly narratives shift, tracking who stays engaged and who fades back, tracking which explanations stretch and which collapse under their own weight. And tracking creates pressure that outrage never could, because outrage burns fast. Tracking lasts. This is where the story reaches its turning point, not through confrontation, but through alignment. Old interviews line up with newer reactions. Past confidence sits next to present restraint. What was once brushed off as context now feels like pattern. No accusations are needed. The pattern speaks, and patterns don't demand belief. They invite recognition. Recognition that silence showed up at the same points every time. Recognition that clarity was always closest when it was least expected. Recognition that accountability was delayed not once, but consistently. That consistency is the turning key. Because once people see consistency, they stop asking whether something is intentional. They start asking what the intention was. That question can't be answered with silence. It can't be outrun with time. It sits there, growing heavier with every non-response. This is why the system feels different now. Not threatened, exposed. Exposed not by revelation, but by repetition. By the realization that the same techniques were used again and again because they worked, until they didn't. Because now silence doesn't calm curiosity. It feeds it. It doesn't close conversations. It deepens them. It doesn't protect distance. It highlights it. This is the point where the audience no longer waits for permission to connect dots. They connect them naturally, quietly, methodically. And once that starts, the story stops belonging to whoever controls the narrative. It belongs to the pattern. From here on, every pause is read, every delay is noted, every absence is interpreted. Silence becomes louder than any statement ever could. That's the turn, not a reveal, not a confession, but a realization that silence no longer holds the power it once did. And once that realization settles in, the direction of the story is no longer up for negotiation. It moves forward on its own. From this point on, silence stops delaying the story and starts accelerating it. Because once people recognize a pattern, every new moment is measured against it. Every response is weighed. Every absence is noticed. And what once felt neutral now feels meaningful. This is where attention becomes disciplined, not emotional, not reactionary, focused. People aren't looking for a headline anymore. They're watching behavior unfold in real time. Who leans in, who steps back, who speaks confidently, and who suddenly becomes careful. These shifts are subtle, but they're impossible to miss when you're paying attention. And people are paying attention now. That attention strips away excuses. It doesn't argue with explanations. It compares them. It doesn't demand answers immediately. It watches how long answers are delayed. And delay, repeated often enough, becomes its own message. This is why silence feels heavier than it ever has before. Because silence used to suggest control. Now it suggests avoidance. The difference matters. Avoidance creates tension without needing confrontation. It invites interpretation. It forces the audience to fill in gaps, not with imagination, but with memory. Memory of past statements, past confidence, past willingness to engage. When those memories don't line up with present restraint, something feels off. That feeling doesn't fade. It lingers after the video ends. It follows into comment sections, interviews, and future appearances. It becomes part of how every move is read. This is the stage where the system can no longer reset the conversation. New topics arise, new stories break, but the same question keeps returning underneath them. Why was silence chosen again? And once that question attaches itself to a story, it doesn't let go easily. Because the audience has learned something crucial. Silence isn't the absence of truth. It's the management of it. Management through delay, management through distance, management through waiting for attention to move elsewhere. But attention isn't moving. It's refining. It's becoming harder to distract, harder to overwhelm, harder to exhaust. People aren't consuming information anymore. They're contextualizing it. Context changes everything. It turns coincidence into repetition. It turns restraint into calculation. It turns silence into evidence of design. This doesn't mean conclusions are being drawn. It means expectations are changing. People no longer expect closure on someone else's terms. They expect coherence. They expect explanations that hold up across time, not just moments. And until that coherence appears, silence doesn't calm the conversation. It fuels it. That's the position the story is in now, not on the edge of a reveal, not at the point of collapse, but in a space where every unanswered question strengthens the one beneath it. Because once people stop waiting for answers and start tracking behavior, the story no longer needs momentum to survive. It sustains itself. And silence, no matter how carefully maintained, can't stop that anymore. Every long story reaches a point where it no longer needs momentum to continue. It carries itself. Not because everything has been revealed, but because the framework is now visible. The audience can see how power moved, how silence operated, and how time was used not to clarify, but to outlast questions. And once that framework is seen, it can't be unseen. What began as scattered moments has become a pattern that explains itself, not through confession, not through exposure, through repetition, through behavior that stayed consistent even as circumstances changed. That's the quiet truth at the center of this conversation. Silence was never a pause. It was a process that protected access, preserved influence, and allowed unresolved questions to age into irrelevance. For years, that process worked because attention moved on. Curiosity faded. Memory softened. But attention didn't fade this time. It learned. People learned how to listen to what wasn't being said, how to notice when clarity was closest and avoided, how to recognize that distance was not humility, but insulation. That learning is irreversible. This story doesn't need a verdict to matter. It doesn't need a final reveal to stay alive. It matters because it shows how systems protect themselves without ever announcing it, how silence can be dressed up as wisdom, how waiting can replace accountability. And now that mechanism is exposed, not dramatically, but unmistakably. The most unsettling realization isn't that something went wrong. It's that everything worked exactly as designed. The system didn't fail. It functioned. It rewarded discretion. It discouraged disruption. It allowed momentum to outweigh reflection. And for a long time, that design held strong. Until people stopped consuming stories and started comparing them, comparing past confidence with present restraint, comparing openness in safe moments with silence under pressure, comparing what was offered with what was withheld. That comparison doesn't demand belief. It demands coherence. And coherence is the one thing silence can't provide forever. From here on, the story doesn't end. It changes shape. It moves from spectacle to scrutiny, from reaction to awareness, from waiting for answers to understanding why answers were delayed. This isn't about cancellation. It isn't about redemption. It's about whether accountability remains an event, rare, contained, and temporary, or finally becomes a process that can't be paused, redirected, or buried in time. Because once people understand how silence protected power, they don't stop with one name. They don't stop with one era. They keep asking. And questions like these don't disappear when the video ends. They linger. They sharpen. They follow silence wherever it goes. That's where this story truly concludes. Not with certainty, but with clarity, and a silence that no longer controls the conversation.